My granddaughter came closer while I was stirring the soup and whispered, "Grandpa, I think Mom put something in your food." I kept smiling, but my hand trembled ever so slightly. In that moment, I realized my own family might be hiding something from me, and my reaction was the last thing they expected. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. My name is Harvey Miller. I'm 69 years old and I still run my tool company here in Shaker Heights, Ohio. Miller Tools and Supply Co. was born from my calloused hands over 4 decades ago, and to this day, I wake up every morning with the same drive I had in my early 20s. Have you ever thought about what it's like to build something from scratch and watch it grow like it's your own child? That's exactly how I feel about my business. A widower for 8 years now, I've found comfort in a structured routine as my way of moving forward. Life can be unpredictable, but work has always been my anchor. At my company, I've never done mass layoffs, even when tough times hit hard. I've always treated every employee like part of the family, building relationships based on mutual trust. When you dedicate decades of your life to building something solid, you expect the people around you to value it, especially those who share your last name, especially the ones you raised with love. Watching my legacy take shape brick by brick has always given me a deep sense of purpose. Russell, my son, has been working with me as operations director for nearly a decade. He's always been smart and ambitious, qualities that filled me with fatherly pride. He understood the business, knew the numbers better than I did. He was great with suppliers and always showed real interest in the company. Russell grew up watching me work hard every day, sat in on meetings since he was a teen and knew every aspect of the operation. It felt natural for him to take on more responsibility in the family business. Hope, my daughter-in-law, was always polite and helpful. An experienced nurse specialized in geriatric care, she had that gentle way about her, the kind that comes from helping people. She often suggested I get more checkups, eat better, and rest more on weekends. To me, it all sounded like genuine concern from a healthcare professional. It made sense that a daughter-in-law would care about her father-in-law's well-being, that a wife would encourage her husband to be more present in his father's life. I took it all as sincere family care. But if there's someone who's always brought light into my life, it's my granddaughter Noelle, 8 years old, curious, and smart in ways that surprise me every day. She loves coming over, playing with my old tools, asking how everything works. We spend hours together in the garage, and she soaks up every word like a little sponge. Noelle has always been my favorite companion, with those bright eyes full of curiosity about the world. She had a special bond with me that went beyond words. For a long time, those afternoons with Noelle were my peaceful refuge. But little by little, I started noticing subtle changes in Russell and Hope's behavior. First, it was small comments during team meetings. Russell began interrupting my presentations with things like, "Dad, that doesn't work in today's market anymore," or, "We need to modernize these outdated methods." At first, I tried to see it as constructive feedback from someone younger and more in tune with current trends. But the comments became more frequent, and the tone completely changed. They became public corrections that made me feel like an employee being scolded, not the founder of the company. Then Hope ramped up her concerns about my health. She'd show up at my house with vitamins I never asked for, special teas to boost memory, supplements she said were essential for men your age. She insisted I take everything just right, like I was a child who needed supervision. When I questioned it, she'd sigh and say she was just looking out for the family's well-being. Funny how care can start to feel like control when you stop to think about it. But back then I wasn't thinking clearly yet. Then came the financial pressure, disguised as concern. Russell suggested I should delegate more responsibilities, and maybe it was time to consider partial retirement. Hope would add that I seemed overwhelmed, and that men your age need to slow down. They started talking about succession planning and securing the future with a level of insistence that made me uncomfortable. Every family conversation seemed to revolve around my ability to make decisions. It felt like they were laying the groundwork for something bigger. Things got weirder when I noticed my time with Noelle was being monitored. Hope always had some reason to be around whenever my granddaughter came to visit. "Just making sure you're not overdoing it," she'd say with a smile that never reached her eyes. Russell started suggesting the visits should be more structured and less frequent. He said Noelle was interfering with my recovery. Recovery from what? I wondered. My only real companion was being gradually pushed away, and I was beginning to feel the isolation. And then came that meeting where Russell completely lost his professional composure. In front of 3 longtime employees, he questioned my cognitive ability to make key decisions for the company. He said I was resistant to change and that it was hurting the company's growth. It was the first time I felt ashamed in my own company, in the place I had built with so much sweat. The employees were visibly uncomfortable. I felt humiliated. And Russell just smiled like he'd done something necessary. In that moment, a bitter doubt started to grow inside me. It was as if my own family was turning against me, but I still resisted believing it. Things came to a head on a Tuesday afternoon. Russell barged into my office without knocking and slammed the door behind him. He planted both hands on my desk and looked me straight in the eye. Either you hand over control of the company now or we'll settle this in court. There was no more pretending, no more subtlety. It was a blunt ultimatum. I swallowed hard and asked if he was serious. He just smiled in a way I'd never seen before. Dead serious, Dad. You'll see it's for the best. Then he walked out, slamming the door and leaving me alone with his words echoing in my head. The next day I got a call from Hope around late morning. Her voice was sweet, almost embarrassed. Harvey, Russell told me you two had a disagreement yesterday. How about coming over for dinner tonight? I think it would be good for us to talk as a family. I could hear Russell in the background whispering instructions. I'll make your favorite soup, she continued. That veggie one you're always praising. Russell wants to apologize for the way he spoke to you. The change in tone was suspicious, but maybe my son had taken the night to reconsider. Maybe some sleep had made him realize he'd gone too far. I arrived at their house right on time. Noelle ran up to hug me like she always did, but I noticed something different. She was quieter, less spontaneous. Russell greeted me with a firm handshake and a forced smile. Dad, thanks for coming. I want to apologize for the way I spoke to you yesterday. Hope appeared soon after, being extremely attentive. It felt too theatrical, too rehearsed. But I wanted to believe it was genuine. Hope brought the soup in a special bowl and served my portion with extra care. I added some special ingredients to help you recover better, she said with a glowing smile. Noelle was picking at her food, not really eating. She kept glancing at me, then at her parents, then back at the plate. Russell talked about finding common ground and working together, but his eyes didn't match his words. Hope nodded along with everything he said, overly enthusiastically. Then she got up to get more bread from the kitchen, and that's when it happened. Noelle leaned in toward me, quickly checked to make sure her parents weren't watching, and whispered the words that changed everything. Grandpa, I think Mom put something in your soup. My blood ran cold instantly. I kept smiling and complimented the flavor of the soup, but my mind was racing. My granddaughter's warning echoed in my ears like a blaring alarm. Hope came back from the kitchen. Russell continued his act of remorse, but now I was seeing everything differently. The ultimatum yesterday, the sudden dinner invite, the special ingredients, Noelle's strange behavior. With calculated movements, I stood up and said I needed to use the bathroom. Of course, Dad, Russell said, but don't take too long. We want to keep talking. His smile didn't reach his eyes. In the bathroom, I locked the door and took a deep breath. The puzzle pieces suddenly clicked into place. This wasn't an apology. It was a setup. The ultimatum had been just the first attempt. Dinner was plan B. My own family was trying to drug me to take me out of the picture. I pulled out my phone with trembling hands but growing resolve. It was time to act, and this time, I'd play their game. Only now, I knew the rules. That's when everything changed. In the bathroom, I took out my phone and called 911, speaking firmly but softly. I need police assistance. I believe my family is trying to poison me right now. I'm at their house. The dispatcher asked for basic information. Name, address, what was happening. I quickly explained about the ultimatum yesterday, tonight's suspicious dinner, and the warning I received. Mr. Miller, an officer will be there in 15 minutes. Can you stay safe until then? I said yes, but that I had to go back to the table to avoid suspicion. She told me not to eat anything and to stay calm. 15 minutes. That's all I had to hold on. I washed my hands slowly, took a deep breath, and returned to the dining room with the most natural expression I could manage. "Sorry I took so long," I said, smiling. Russell and Hope had been whispering, but they stopped as soon as they saw me. The soup was still there, cooling in the bowl. "Come on, Dad. Have some while it's still warm," Hope urged, gently pushing the plate toward me. Russell nodded. "Yeah, Dad." Hope really put effort into this one. I picked up the spoon, smelled the contents, and made an approving face. "It's got a different aroma." "Special," I said, touching the spoon lightly to my lips without actually tasting it. "Those are herbs I learned about in my geriatric nutrition course," Hope explained, watching my every move with suspicious attention. "They'll help you relax and digest better." Russell backed up every word with enthusiastic nods. Noelle kept stirring her food, avoiding eye contact with me. I started buying time by telling an old story about when I built my first workshop. You know how it is. The older you get, the more vivid the memories become. Hope and Russell exchanged a look they couldn't quite hide. It was like they were thinking, "Perfect. He's already confused." "Dad, how about at least trying the broth?" Hope insisted again, her voice carrying a hint of impatience masked as concern. "You've barely touched your food since you got back from the bathroom." Russell added, "Yeah, Dad, you seem a bit distracted. Maybe you really do need something to help you relax." It was amazing how they twisted everything to fit their narrative, pretending to care while pushing me closer to what I now knew was a carefully planned setup. But they didn't know I'd already figured it out. I kept playing along, stirring the soup and making vague comments about the flavor. Suddenly, Noelle knocked over her glass of water, making a loud noise and drawing everyone's attention. "Sorry, Grandpa," she said, but when our eyes met for a split second, she gave me a barely noticeable shake of the head, a subtle no only I could catch. As Hope and Russell got up to clean the mess, I realized my granddaughter was creating a deliberate distraction. My heart swelled with pride and gratitude for that brave little girl. It was a silent confirmation that we were on the same side. When Hope returned with towels to dry the table, I said, "How about we save the soup for later? I'm more interested in our conversation about the company." Russell looked pleased, thinking I was giving in to yesterday's pressure. "I'm glad you want to talk, Dad," Russell said, sitting back down. "I think we can find a solution that works for everyone." Hope nodded eagerly, but I noticed her eyes kept drifting to my untouched plate. The quiet revenge was already in motion. They had no idea I'd called the police. I kept the conversation going about a gradual transition and delegating responsibilities, feeding their illusion that the plan was working. With every minute that passed, I knew I was closer to flipping this whole thing. They thought they were fooling me, but I was just waiting for the perfect moment to show all my cards. The conversation went on for a few more minutes, with Russell explaining his modern vision for the company, and Hope making comments about how I seemed more open to dialogue. I agreed with everything, asked questions, showed genuine interest. It was surreal how they could keep up that act while trying to drug me. Every now and then, Hope would still suggest I at least take one spoonful of the soup, but I always shifted the subject. Noelle stayed quiet, but I could feel her concern. When I heard the distant sound of cars approaching, my heart started racing. It was the moment of truth. Russell stopped mid-sentence when we heard firm knocks on the front door. "Who could that be at this hour?" Hope asked, frowning. "We're not expecting anyone," Russell added, standing up with a confused look. I just smiled calmly and said, "I think you should answer it." The knocking grew louder, followed by an official voice. "Cleveland Police, please open the door." That was when Hope and Russell's expressions completely changed. The color drained from their faces. Noelle looked at me wide-eyed, but there was a flicker of relief in her gaze. Hope and Russell looked at each other in total panic. "Harvey, you called the police?" Hope stammered, her voice trembling. Russell tried to stay composed. "Dad, this is just a misunderstanding. We can settle this as a family." But the knocking got more urgent. I calmly stood up from my chair, walked over to Noelle, and placed a protective hand on her shoulder. "There's no misunderstanding," I replied firmly. "There's just a poisoning attempt that got stopped in time." The realization hit them like a train. Their entire performance collapsed at once. Hope burst into tears. Russell started yelling that I was insane. I walked toward the door, but Russell grabbed my arm tightly. "You're not doing this to us," he said with a level of intensity I'd never seen before. "Not after everything we built together." Hope joined him, blocking my path. "Harvey, think about the family. Think about Noelle. Do you really want to expose a child to this?" It was unbelievable how they were still trying to manipulate me, even with the police at the door. But this time, I was in control. I looked straight into Russell's eyes and said, "You should have thought about the family before trying to poison me." The rage in his eyes told me they wouldn't go down easily. "Dad, if you open that door, you'll regret it for the rest of your life," Russell whispered, his voice laced with barely hidden menace. Hope added, "We have more power over your estate than you think, and over Noelle's custody too." At that moment, I realized they had more cards up their sleeve than I'd imagined. My granddaughter watched everything in silence, and I could see she was afraid. Not just of what was happening now, but of what could happen to her afterward. This was a much bigger battle than just avoiding poisoning. It was a war for my life, my company, and most of all, Noelle's safety. The police kept knocking on the door. Russell and Hope stared at me with a mix of desperation and dangerous determination. And Noelle was caught in the middle of it all. What I did next wouldn't just affect my life. It would shape the future of the only person in that house who truly mattered. As I walked toward the door, one terrible question echoed in my mind. Was I saving Noelle, or putting her in even greater danger? I took a deep breath and walked to the door, ignoring Russell and Hope's desperate protests. When I opened it, 2 uniformed officers and a detective in a dark suit were waiting for me. "Mr. Miller, I'm Detective Rodriguez," the older man said, showing his badge. "We received your call about a possible poisoning attempt." I invited them in with the calmest voice I could manage. Russell and Hope were frozen in the middle of the room like statues. Noelle remained seated at the table, watching everything with wide eyes but saying nothing. "Please come into the dining room," I said, gesturing for them to follow me. Detective Rodriguez surveyed the scene with experienced eyes. The table still set, half-eaten plates, the soup cooling in my untouched bowl. "All of you, please step away from the table," he ordered with professional authority. One of the officers pulled out a camera and began taking photos of the scene. Russell tried to move closer but was stopped by the second officer. Hope stayed on her feet, visibly shaking, her hands clasped in front of her like she was praying. The detective pulled latex gloves from his pocket and carefully walked around the table. "This is the soup in question?" he asked, pointing to my plate. I nodded in confirmation. He pulled out small evidence collection vials and began taking samples of the liquid. "I'll need you to show me all the ingredients used to prepare this meal," he said, looking directly at Hope. She pointed with a trembling hand toward the kitchen. One of the officers followed her to collect the herbs and seasonings she had mentioned during dinner. Russell finally found his voice, but it came out as a desperate shout. "This is ridiculous. We were just having a family dinner. My father is clearly confused." The detective completely ignored him and continued his methodical work. Russell tried a different approach. "You can't just barge into our home like this. I demand to speak to a lawyer." But his outrage sounded far too forced, too theatrical. Even to someone without police training, it was obvious he was lying. The sweat on his forehead and his heavy breathing gave him away. Hope returned from the kitchen with the officer, who was carrying a collection of jars and packets. "It was just something natural to help him relax," she said tearfully, trying to appear innocent. "Just some herbal medicine, things I learned from my work as a nurse." The detective examined each container closely, reading labels and smelling the contents. "Interesting," he murmured, placing some of the items into evidence bags. "Some of these substances require a prescription." Hope turned even paler, if that was possible. Noelle got up from her chair and slowly walked toward me. Instinctively, I reached out and pulled her close, holding her in a protective stance that didn't go unnoticed by the detective. "Is she your granddaughter?" he asked gently. I nodded, explaining that she was the one who warned me about the soup. Russell immediately protested. "She's just a child. She doesn't know what she saw." But the detective had already noticed the girl's strange behavior since arriving. Noelle leaned in closer to me, as if seeking protection. The detective approached us and crouched down to Noelle's level. "Hi, sweetheart. Can you tell me what you saw?" His voice was gentle, clearly experienced in speaking to children in tough situations. Noelle looked at me for reassurance, and I nodded with quiet courage. "I saw Mommy put things in Grandpa's soup," she said, her voice low but clear. "Things that weren't regular food." Hope exploded. "She doesn't know what she's saying. She's just an 8-year-old girl." But her hysterical tone only made the child's statement more credible. I pulled out my phone and showed it to the detective. "I recorded what she told me earlier," I explained, playing the audio from the moment Noelle warned me about the soup. The girl's voice came through clearly. "Grandpa, I think Mom put something in your soup." The detective listened closely, then asked me to send him the file. Russell and Hope looked at each other in full-blown panic. The evidence was piling up fast against them, and there was no denying what had been recorded. Hope went into full meltdown when she saw the detective saving the audio as evidence. "She's just a kid. She doesn't know what she heard. She was playing, making things up." Her voice grew shriller, more desperate, but her own words betrayed her. How could an experienced nurse not know exactly what substances she was putting in the food? Russell tried to calm her down, but he was clearly panicking too. The house of cards they'd built was collapsing right in front of our eyes. The officer who had been in the kitchen returned with a small case. "Detective, I brought the rapid test kit," he announced. Within minutes, he had taken a sample of the soup and applied the reagents. When the result appeared, the detective shook his head gravely. "Mr. Miller, you were right. There are sedative substances present in this broth." The silence that followed was deafening. Hope began to sob, and Russell turned white as a sheet. Family betrayal had just been confirmed by science. Detective Rodriguez stood up straight and took on his official stance. "Hope Miller, you're under arrest for attempted poisoning and elder abuse." As one of the officers cuffed her, she kept shouting, "It was just to help him relax. It wouldn't have done any harm." Russell tried to intervene physically, pushing the officer who was arresting his wife. It was a fatal mistake. The second officer immediately restrained him and cuffed him too. "Russell Miller, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice and being an accomplice to attempted poisoning." The family dinner had turned into a crime scene. As Hope and Russell were led to the police car, neighbors started coming out of their homes to see what was going on. Lights on, people gathering on sidewalks, whispers and curious stares. Detective Rodriguez came over to me before leaving. "Mr. Miller, I need you and your granddaughter to come to the station tomorrow to give formal statements." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Noelle gripped my hand tighter as he continued. "There are also some custody matters concerning the girl that we need to address." One terrible question echoed in my mind. What if, by saving Noelle, I ended up losing her to the system? 3 weeks later, I was sitting on a courtroom bench next to Noelle, who wore her best blue dress. The prosecutor, a seasoned man named Wyatt Hawkins, was organizing his papers at the table while laying out the case for the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, today you'll hear about one of the most despicable crimes there is. A family attempting to poison and rob a vulnerable elderly man." His words echoed through the silent room. Hope and Russell sat at the defense table, her head down, him trying to maintain a dignified posture, but both looked like shadows of who they were on the night of the dinner. Prosecutor Hawkins presented the evidence in a methodical and devastating way. First, the lab results from the soup. Lorazepam and zolpidem in concentrations capable of causing severe sedation and disorientation in a 73-year-old. Then, the medical history he had obtained. Hope Miller had access to these medications through her job as a nurse, violating ethical and legal protocols. With each piece of evidence, I watched the jury shake their heads in disapproval. Russell tried to keep his composure, but his hands were visibly shaking. Hope cried silently, realizing there was no way out. When it was Hope's turn to testify, the prosecutor confronted her with a direct question. "Mrs. Miller, can you explain to the jury how controlled substances ended up in the soup you served your father-in-law?" She gave the same excuse she always had. It was just to help him relax. He'd been very stressed about the business. But the prosecutor didn't stop there. "Relaxed enough to sign over assets? To accept a guardianship that you two had prearranged?" Hope completely broke down, sobbing. "We didn't want to hurt him. It was just to resolve things once and for all." Her confession echoed through the room like thunder. Russell took the witness stand with a different strategy, trying to pin everything on his wife. I didn't know Hope was putting meds in my father's food. He lied shamelessly. When I found out about the guardianship plan, it was her idea. I only signed because she said it was necessary. The prosecutor smiled coldly and displayed the emails Russell had exchanged with a lawyer about reduced mental capacity and urgency in transferring assets. Each time-stamped message proved he not only knew, but had helped orchestrate part of the plan. His defense collapsed in minutes. The hardest part came when they called Noelle to the stand. Even with all the psychological support, seeing an 8-year-old testify against her own parents broke my heart. The judge was extremely gentle. "Noelle, can you tell us what you saw that night in the kitchen?" Her tiny but steady voice echoed through the courtroom. "I saw Mommy taking little bottles from the cupboard and putting stuff in Grandpa's soup." I asked what it was, and she said it was to make him calmer. The silence in the room was deafening. Hope began sobbing louder and Russell bowed his head completely. The judge showed genuine outrage when it was his turn to speak. "In 40 years on the bench, I've rarely seen a case as disturbing as this. Using an innocent child as a witness to a premeditated crime against her own grandfather is despicable." He looked directly at Hope and Russell. "You not only tried to poison a senior citizen, but you traumatized a child in the process." His voice grew in intensity. "This court will not tolerate this kind of family abuse, especially when it involves medication and the manipulation of a vulnerable person." The entire courtroom could feel the judge's restrained fury. The sentence came quickly and harshly. Hope received 5 years in prison for attempted poisoning, elder abuse, and practicing medicine without a license. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "you are permanently prohibited from engaging in any activity related to healthcare." Russell was sentenced to 4 years for complicity, attempted fraud, and financial abuse of an elderly person. "Both of you have lost any legal right to custody of the minor Noelle Miller and any claim to Harvey Miller's estate." The word echoed through the room like a final gavel strike. The consequences went beyond prison. Russell automatically lost his position at the company and any ownership stake he might have held. Hope had her nursing license permanently revoked, making it impossible for her to ever work in the field again. The prosecutor also announced, "The state will investigate other patients who were under Hope Miller's care in the past 5 years. It was the complete destruction of their personal and professional lives. They had lost everything: freedom, family, career, and reputation." After the sentencing, my lawyer accompanied me to the courthouse clerk to formalize a new will. With Noelle by my side, I signed the document naming her as my sole heir, with the inheritance to be released at age 25 under the supervision of a neutral trustee. "This way, no one else can manipulate our family again," I explained to her, and she nodded seriously despite her young age. It was an immense relief to know that my company and assets would be protected from future predators. Noelle would be cared for properly without pressure or premature temptations. We left the courthouse side by side in silence. Reporters shouted questions, photographers fired off flashes, but I kept Noelle close and we walked straight to the car. She didn't say a word the whole ride home, she just held my hand tightly. When we finally arrived at my house, she asked in a small voice, "Grandpa, are they coming back someday?" I looked at her with all the affection I could gather. "Not for a long time, sweetheart. And when they do, you'll be grown and strong enough to protect yourself." It was a promise I intended to keep at any cost. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was liberating. For the first time in months, there was no tension in the air, no hidden motives in every word or gesture. Noelle ran out to the yard to play, and I watched her from the kitchen window. She was smiling, truly smiling, for the first time in a long while. In that moment, I realized we had won more than a legal battle. We had reclaimed our family. Small, but real. And that meant more than any business or inheritance I could ever leave behind. As the sun began to set, Noelle came inside and sat beside me on the couch. "Grandpa," she said, "can we go home now?" I smiled for the first time in weeks and replied, "Of course, honey, it's ours now." That night, she slept in the guest room for the first time since the trial, and I slept peacefully, knowing that our home was finally safe. My quiet response had come full circle, but more importantly, our family, the real one, had survived intact. 2 weeks after the trial, I converted the old home office into a bedroom for Noelle, turning it into a cozy space with a small tool bench just for her. "This way, you can learn the family business the right way," I said, teaching her how to use a small screwdriver. Noelle smiled as she assembled little projects, her hands still small but determined. It felt like she was rebuilding not just objects, but also the trust that had been broken. I watched her every move with genuine pride, knowing we were creating memories that would last a lifetime. Every afternoon, we walked together at Edgewater Park, watching Lake Erie stretch out toward the horizon. These walks became our sacred ritual, a time to talk about everything and nothing, letting Noelle process the recent events at her own pace. "Grandpa, do you think they'll miss us?" she asked one especially quiet afternoon. I thought carefully before answering. "I think they'll miss who they thought we were. But we're much better being who we really are." Noelle nodded with the wisdom of a child who had learned early on the difference between real love and disguised self-interest. The weeks that followed brought a peace I hadn't felt in years. Noelle quickly adapted to our new routine, doing her homework at the kitchen table while I cooked dinner. No more strange phone calls, no unexpected visits, no pressure about my mental capacity. It was extraordinary how simple life could be when no one was trying to manipulate it. I realized that my terrible experience had taught me to treasure the genuine moments. Noelle's laughter, a quiet sunset, a good night's sleep without worries. It was an unexpected way of turning trauma into gratitude. With the help of an elder rights attorney, I started a small local support group for victims of family abuse. Weekly meetings at the community library, where seniors shared experiences and got guidance on how to recognize and report manipulative behavior. The group grew quickly, from 5 people at the first meeting to over 20 in just 2 months. Noelle would sometimes come along, handing out water and cookies, learning about empathy and justice through real-life example. It was comforting to see how something so destructive had become a force for protection in our community. 6 months later, Noelle was smiling as often as any normal child, running around the yard, laughing out loud at cartoons, asking curious questions about everything. I was sleeping peacefully for the first time in years, no longer fearing what might be in my breakfast or who might be plotting behind my back. One particularly quiet evening, as she worked on her homework at the kitchen table, I realized I had found something far more valuable than any business or inheritance. A family built on real love, not on self-interest. Noelle looked up from her notebook and smiled at me, and in that simple moment I knew every hard year had been worth it to get here. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the right. Thanks for watching.